It was supposed to be a routine inspection, just another anonymous boat drifting off the coast of Maine. The Coast Guard cutter approached with calm professionalism, radios crackling, the morning fog dancing on the waves. But as the officers boarded, what they found was anything but ordinary. The man at the helm wasn't just a boater. He wasn't smuggling. He wasn't lost. He was something else entirely. The weathered captain, dressed in a faded navy jacket and a hat stitched with decades-old insignia, didn't flinch when asked for ID. Instead, he looked a young Coast Guard officer in the eye and quietly said his name. What happened next made every man on board freeze. Phones dropped. Salutes were snapped. And silence, thick and reverent, fell over the deck. This wasn't just any captain. This was one of the most decorated, forgotten heroes to ever walk away from war. A man whose battlefield courage had saved hundreds. A ghost from the past. Sailing alone with a secret he'd held for over 50 years. This is his story. A military tribute to a man whose heroic acts were buried by time until a chance encounter made the world remember. The sun had barely risen when Petty Officer Daniels spotted the small vessel on the radar. A lone boat drifting just outside the secure maritime boundary. No distress signals. No registration broadcast. It was unusual, not dangerous, but strange enough to warrant a check. The Coast Guard cutter Sentinel moved in quietly, its engines slicing through the early morning stillness. Salt hung in the air. Fog hung low over the water like a veil. Routine, Daniels thought. Probably a fisherman who forgot to check in. Maybe an old-timer out for a morning sail. They approached slow and steady. As they drew closer, the silhouette of the boat emerged, old, wooden, and clearly hand-maintained. It wasn't new, but it was cared for. Like someone had poured time, love, and memory into every inch of it. The team boarded with the usual commands. Coast Guard, request permission to come aboard. They called out Dot, and then from the cabin a figure emerged. The man looked like time itself had carved him out of history. Thin but upright, sharp eyes under a worn navy cap. His jacket was faded denim, but the patches stitched on it told another story. They were military, old, real, and not the kind you find in thrift shops. Petty Officer Daniels asked for identification. The man said nothing at first. He simply reached into a pocket and handed over a dog-eared leather wallet. No license, no registration. Just a single brittle military ID card, yellowed with age, edges curled. Daniels scanned it. Captain Elias Monroe. The name hit him like a sudden wave. He looked again, this time slower. Elias Monroe. The same Elias Monroe who'd vanished from public record after the Vietnam War. The man once rumored to have led an unsanctioned rescue behind enemy lines. The man whose battalion believed he died saving them, even though no body was ever found. Sir, Daniel said, a little softer now, can you confirm? Is this really you? Monroe gave a tired smile. I reckon it is, son. Everything changed in that moment. The air thickened. The crew that had been alert and ready moments before now stood still, unsure of what to say. This wasn't just a boater. This was living history. This was a walking chapter of a war no one wanted to remember, and yet couldn't forget. One of the junior officers whispered to another, "That's the guy from Firebase Echo, right? The one who saved those medics?" Another nodded. He got a silver star, maybe more, but he disappeared. No one ever knew what happened. Daniel stepped back instinctively, as if giving the man space out of respect. Captain Monroe's eyes scanned the deck, then the horizon. I didn't come here to be found, he said, but I guess some stories won't stay buried forever. It was then that Monroe gestured to the old wooden chest sitting in the middle. of his boat. A chest, locked with iron latches and marked with a hand-carved symbol, the insignia of his old unit, 3rd Recon, Marine Division. "Everything's in there," he said quietly. "Letters, maps, mission notes. The names of men who never made it home. I kept it all. Someone had to." Daniels hesitated. This wasn't protocol. This wasn't anything you could train for. But in that moment, the Coast Guard team did something unusual. They saluted. Every man on deck, young, modern, trained with the latest tech, stood and saluted this man who had fought a war they'd only ever read about. A man whose soldier sacrifice had gone untold, whose heroic acts had been reduced to rumors, and whose veteran story had faded into silence. And Monroe, still standing tall despite the years, returned the salute with the slow, deliberate precision of a Marine who never forgot what it meant. After the salute, Monroe sat on the edge of the boat, gazing into the waves. "I didn't come back for medals," he said softly. "I came to say goodbye to the ones who never got the chance." He explained that he'd been making this trip once a year for over 30 years alone, without fanfare. Each time, he'd release letters overboard, sealed in waterproof containers, addressed to the families of the men he lost under his command. Most of them never got a real farewell. Some never even got news that their loved ones were heroes. "They weren't forgotten to me," he said. "I just didn't know how to tell their story without breaking apart." For a long time, no one spoke. The water lapped gently against the sides of the boats. A distant gull cried. And then something unexpected happened. One of the young Coast Guardsmen, barely 22 years old, stepped forward. He introduced himself quietly. "My grandfather was Corporal Michael Trent. He served in your unit. Firebase Echo. He died there." Monroe's face changed. He blinked hard. "Trent?" he echoed. "Mike Trent? That kid with the harmonica? Always sang off-key?" The young officer nodded. "Yeah, that's what my dad used to say." Monroe reached out and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Your grandfather died saving 6 men, including me. He deserves a monument, and I never got to tell his family." Tears welled in the officer's eyes, and in that instant, generations touched. The past and the present stood side by side, in uniform, bonded by duty, sacrifice, and blood. One was a forgotten hero, the other a man living in the shadow of that heroism. The chest was opened that day. The stories poured out like floodwater, real names, real moments, real war heroes finally given their due. That morning, the Coast Guard didn't just inspect a boat. They discovered a living legacy, a tribute not only to Elias Monroe, but to all the unsung heroes who had been lost in the noise of history. A chance to finally tell their truth, and it all began with a name. The year was 1971. Vietnam was in its bloodiest phase. The air was thick with smoke, and the ground soaked with the weight of too many good men lost. Captain Elias Monroe, then just 32 years old, led a small recon unit known only by their call sign, Echo 9. They were deep in the Quang Tro province, behind enemy lines, with one mission: rescue a group of trapped medics from a downfield hospital near Firebase Echo, surrounded on all sides by North Vietnamese forces. It wasn't their job. Command had already written the trap team off. Too far. Too risky. No reinforcements available, they said, but Elias had a different kind of leadership running through his veins. He didn't see a lost cause. He saw men and women, medics, people who had saved lives and now needed someone to save theirs. So he made a decision that would define his life forever. He looked at his 11 men and said, "We're going in. No orders. No backup. Just us." They didn't hesitate. Because when Elias Monroe spoke, people listened, not out of fear, but out of trust. He was the kind of leader who marched in front, not behind. the kind who knew each of his men by name, by story, by heartbeat, and so began a mission that would turn them into unsung heroes and make Monroe a ghost in the eyes of the military. The jungle swallowed them whole within minutes. Sweat mixed with grime. Mosquitoes buzzed in their ears. But the silence was absolute. They moved like shadows, trained and tuned to one another with a bond stronger than blood. After 2 days of tracking, dodging patrols, and sleeping beneath roots, they reached the edge of Firebase Echo. What they saw chilled them. The hospital tents had been torn apart. Fires smoldered. Bodies were strewn across the compound, enemy and allied alike. The medics, a team of 9, were alive. Barely. Huddled in a collapsed bunker, running out of water, ammo, and time. Between Elias' team and the medics lay nearly 30 enemy fighters. Any sane commander would have pulled back, but Elias didn't calculate in numbers. He calculated in lives. He broke the unit into 2, one to flank, one to create a distraction. He personally led the frontal assault. A bold, almost reckless move, but he knew his men. He knew their strength. And he knew he couldn't ask someone to risk a life if he wasn't willing to stand in front. The fight was brutal, intimate, the kind of battle you feel in your bones long after the last bullet is fired. Explosions rocked the compound. Shouts, screams, and smoke blurred everything. But the result? They saved all 9 medics. They carried the wounded, bandaged the broken. And when reinforcements finally arrived, called in by one of the medics on a salvaged radio, they found the survivors, the rescued, and the remnants of Echo 9, huddled together. 4 of Monroe's men didn't make it. 2 more were badly wounded, and Elias Monroe was gone. No one saw him fall. No one found his body. Only his rifle was recovered, leaning against the remains of a medical tent, and a bloodied piece of his uniform. The Army declared him KIA killed in action. Posthumously, he was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart. His family was handed a folded flag. The world moved on, but Monroe hadn't died. He'd simply walked away. So why did a man who had become a real war hero, a legend, vanish? That question haunted everyone until he spoke on that boat all those years later. I saw their faces. He told Petty Officer Daniels, every one of them, the men I lost, the ones I couldn't carry back, and I couldn't carry the weight either. Not back home, not to parades, not to medals. Monroe said he made a choice, one no military protocol could explain. Instead of returning with the survivors, he slipped into the jungle. He followed rivers, passed through abandoned villages, and survived off the land until he reached a quiet fishing village weeks later. A local priest took him in, nursed his wounds, helped him find a path home. Months later, on an unmarked cargo ship. By then, the Army had declared him dead, and he decided to let that truth stand. I wasn't a hero, he said. I was just lucky enough to outlive my brothers. That didn't feel like something to celebrate. He changed his name, bought a boat. And every year, on the anniversary of that mission, he sailed to the exact coordinates where Firebase Echo once stood, and mourned. The Coast Guard crew listening that day didn't know what to say. Here was a man who had done what most wouldn't dare, who embodied battlefield courage, made the ultimate soldier sacrifice, and then chose silence over spotlight. But that silence was ending. Because now, aboard that boat, with the chest of letters and the truth finally spoken aloud, the past was surfacing like a ghost finally coming home. Monroe handed Daniels a sealed envelope. For the Department of Defense, he said, you can tell them now. I'm ready. Daniels nodded. And then, as the fog began to lift and sunlight warmed the deck, Monroe said something that none of them would ever forget. I didn't save those medics alone. I had men with me, young, brave. They deserve this story more than I ever did. Make sure people know their names, not just mine." And with that, the man who had been a ghost for half a century, the very definition of a forgotten hero, asked for one thing, not recognition, not a medal, just memory. The chest creaked open like a coffin releasing a secret. The moment its lid lifted, the air seemed to shift, heavier, slower, charged with emotion. Inside was no gold, no weapons, no war trophies. Only time captured on paper, letters, photos, rusted harmonica, dog tags strung together like prayer beads, and a thick, leather-bound journal, its edges frayed, but the ink inside still legible. The front was marked with a single phrase, hand-etched in block letters. "If I don't make it back, tell them who they were." Captain Elias Monroe hadn't filled that chest with memories of himself. He had filled it with the lives of the men he loved and lost, every soldier he commanded, every medic he saved, every friend who didn't come home, the Coast Guard crew who had boarded the boat expecting to find a violation of maritime code, now stood over what could only be described as a sacred vault of military legacy. Even the youngest officers understood this wasn't a chest. It was a battlefield memorial floating on open water. Daniels carefully lifted the journal. The first page was simple. Echo 9 Recon Unit -1971 Kia, CPL, Michael Trent, PFC, Luis Santiago, SGT, Freddie Hall, LT James, Skip Barlow. Below, the names were stories handwritten by Monroe, some stained with water, others with something darker. Each entry detailed not just how they died, but how they lived. Michael Trent, the harmonica player, had a fiancée named Clara back home in Kansas. He never got to send her the letter he wrote in the bunker the night before the mission. Luis. Santiago always carried his mother's rosary in his sock. Said it kept him grounded, Monroe wrote. Said his mother told him it would bring him home. He never made it, but the rosary did. I sent it to her. SGT Hall was the unit's joker. He once carved a chessboard into his helmet. Played against himself to stay sharp. Freddie was smart, Monroe noted, but he volunteered for point position that day. Said he'd rather get shot first than let any of the younger guys take the hit. These weren't just facts. These were real war heroes, drawn in their full humanity. Flawed, brave, young. So painfully young. Then came a stack of letters Monroe had never mailed. Sealed, addressed, yellowed by time. To the parents of PVT Kenneth. Red Harmon. To Mrs. Lillian Barlow. To the Santiago family. To Clara Mendez from Mike. The Coast Guard crew passed them around with trembling hands. Daniels swallowed hard. These are the letters he was dropping into the sea every year? Monroe nodded. Didn't know where to send them. Didn't think they'd matter anymore. I needed them to be heard. Even if it was only by the ocean. One by one, he told the stories behind each letter. The young man who dove on a grenade. The medic who stayed behind to tend a wounded civilian, only to vanish in the next mortar blast. The radio operator who gave up his seat on the evac chopper for a dying comrade. Every tale was a military tribute, told not with grandeur, but with raw, honest reverence. And then, something extraordinary happened. The youngest member of the Coast Guard team, Ensign Malik, barely 21, took out his phone and, with Monroe's permission, began taking pictures of the documents. We can scan them, digitize, archive, get these to their families, to the DOD, maybe even the Library of Congress. Monroe didn't protest. In fact, for the first time that morning, he smiled. A real, deep, unguarded smile. The kind that only comes when grief begins to let go. I didn't think anyone would care anymore, he said softly. Daniel stepped forward. Sir, These are the kinds of stories that should be taught in schools. These are the men we owe our lives to. The chest also contained one final envelope, unsealed, marked in fading red ink. Classified. Eyes only. Inside were mission. Maps. Coordinates. First-hand notes of what had gone wrong in the planning of Firebase Echo's defense. Details Monroe had never shared, not even in his debrief. When asked why he kept it hidden, Monroe answered plainly, because no one wanted to hear that the command failed. They wanted a clean story. Heroes die, flags wave. But I couldn't let that be the only version. These men didn't die because of bad luck. They died because their request for backup was denied. And I needed the truth to outlive me. Silence. Not the kind that feels empty, but the kind that feels like a church sacred, still heavy with meaning. The Coast Guard officers, moved beyond words, made a decision that day that broke protocol, but honored their duty in the deepest sense. They stayed with Monroe until sundown. Not because they had to, because they needed to. They helped him sort the chest, photograph every page, record every name. They took turns reading the letters aloud, letting those men's voices echo across the waves once more. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, Monroe stood at the bow of his boat and saluted the sea. Then he turned to Daniels. "I think it's time," he said. "Time I stopped carrying all of this alone." And just like that, the man who had carried the weight of 11 fallen souls for over 50 years was finally allowing others to carry it with him. The chest wasn't closed that night. It was kept open, because their stories, their sacrifices, and their truths would no longer rest at the bottom of the ocean. They would rise through emotional storytelling, through memorials, through the voices of those who finally knew their names. This wasn't just Elias Monroe's story anymore. It was their story. A story that had waited too long to be told. The next morning, the wind was still. The sea, calm as glass. The Coast Guard cutter and Monroe's boat floated side by side, tethered by ropes. But more than that, now tethered by history. Captain Elias Monroe stood at the stern of his vessel, wearing his full Navy dress uniform. It no longer fit like it used to. The metals were old, dulled by time, and the threads of the fabric tugged with every breeze. But to the men around him, it didn't matter. He wore it like a flag. The Coast Guard had arranged it all overnight. Quietly, respectfully. A military honor detail would arrive soon, a formal transfer of records, arrangements for a memorial service, letters to be hand-delivered to families. But before any of that, Monroe had one request. "Let me say goodbye, the way I always meant to." The boat turned toward a quiet cove, the last place Monroe and his men had stood together. He guided the vessel to the center of the bay, opened a wooden chest one final time, and removed 11 small sealed canisters, each containing a letter, a name, and a piece of that soldier's memory. One by one, he knelt at the edge of the deck and released them into the sea. "They deserve a grave," he whispered, "even if it's made of water." Each splash into the ocean was like a heartbeat, soft, final, sacred. After the last canister sank beneath the surface, Monroe stood tall, his back straight. His hand rose in salute, slow, steady, unshaking. The entire Coast Guard cutter stood with him, saluting in silence. Then a bugler lifted his trumpet and played taps. The haunting notes floated over the water, echoing between the cliffs. The sound seemed to carry something with it, not just sorrow, but gratitude. As if the very sea had joined in the mourning. Not a soul moved, not a breath was wasted, because this wasn't just a man honoring his fallen brothers. This was the moment they finally came home. In the days that followed, the story spread like wildfire. But not the sensational kind, not viral headlines. Not controversy. Just truth. A humble man. A forgotten war. A secret mission that had lived in silence for half a century. And a chest full of names the world had almost lost. News outlets picked it up. Rin organizations called him a symbol. Families who had lived for decades without answers suddenly held letters and shaking hands. Sons and daughters of soldiers they never knew were remembered with honor. A granddaughter read her grandfather's words for the first time. Words he wrote with shaking fingers in a muddy bunker moments before the end. The Department of Defense reopened the files on Firebase Echo. Posthumous medals were reviewed. Names of Echo 9 were carved into a new wall at the National Veterans Cemetery. Not as statistics. Not as shadows, but as real war heroes. Monroe was offered awards, interviews, a book deal. He declined them all. Instead, he donated the chest, every letter, every artifact, to the National Archives. But he made only one request. Tell the truth. Tell it the way it happened. Don't clean it up. Don't make it pretty. Just make it real. And that's exactly what happened. A permanent exhibit now stands, titled simply, Echo 9, The Men Who Weren't Forgotten. Visitors walk through in silence. They read Monroe's journal. They listen to recordings of the letters. They hear Clara Mendez's voice as she reads the final words of Michael Trent. They see the harmonica, the dog tags, the blood-stained maps. And maybe, just maybe, they walk away changed. As for Elias Monroe, he returned to the sea, not as a ghost this time, but as a guardian. Each year, he sails back to that cove. But now, he's not alone. Young veterans join him, sons of the fallen, daughters in uniform, men and women who carry the same weight he once bore alone. They don't go for ceremony. They go to remember. They go to listen. They go to honor, because that's what this story became. Not just a story of one man's heroic acts, but a story of unsung heroes finally being heard. A story of soldier sacrifice that refused to be buried. A story of what it means to live for others and die for something greater. The final time Daniel saw Monroe, he asked him what he hoped people would take away from everything. Monroe looked out at the water for a long time before answering. Hope they remember that bravery isn't about being fearless, he said. It's about being terrified and still moving forward. I hope they remember the men who died with dirt in their hands and love in their hearts. And I hope, when someone asks about the cost of freedom, they tell our story. He paused, then added, and maybe, just maybe, they'll stand a little straighter next time they hear the flag being raised.